been talking about how we look at a weekend like this as a reason, not an excuse. I don't want it to sound demeaning or insulting. We look at a weekend like this, an extended 3-day weekend and a holiday on Memorial Day, and we look at it as a reason to get together with loved ones and spend time with them and appreciate them, to enjoy our leisure time, to enjoy the downtime that we have living in this country. It's a blessing to live in a republic where we have the freedom to celebrate downtime like that, and where memorial celebrations such as Memorial Day weekend are not requirements where the government makes us line up and watch military parades celebrating the military might of our nation. It is a blessing to live in a republic where we can just memorialize the people who have died for the cause of this country by gathering together with the people we care the most about and have the freedom to spend time with. One of the most oft-read passages for Memorial Day weekend at memorial services and the services for those who have died in the line of duty is from John 15. And Jesus says, "There's no greater gift than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." And dignitaries and speakers and heads of state and governors and politicians of all stripes like to quote that passage when they talk about soldiers and sailors and Marines and airmen and others who have died in service to the United States. And oftentimes people who have no respect for the Bible, people who have no cause or concern for the words of Christ as they're written in Scripture, in other areas will joyfully quote John 15 and say, "No greater gift is there than to lay down your life for a friend." And ironically, when they quote that, they're not talking about sailors, soldiers, airmen, and Marines, because Jesus wasn't talking about sailors and soldiers and airmen and Marines. He wasn't talking about sheriff's deputies. He wasn't talking about cops. He wasn't talking about anybody in the law enforcement world. Jesus was talking about himself. Jesus was talking about his ministry. Jesus was talking about what he came to do. Jesus was talking about laying down his life as the greatest of gifts. Not because every single person that he experienced as he lived for 33 years was a friend of his. Not because every single person that would ever live or ever had lived would become his friend, but because he was teaching us that his one self-sacrificing, self-serving of others gift was to die a sinner's death. To die the death that every single one of us deserves. And that is the reality. If you are drawing breath today, which clearly, if you're in Lanesboro for the bike trail or to see the old architecture of the early 19 and 1800s of southeast Minnesota, you're drawing breath. If you're not drawing breath, please sit down where you are so we can get you some help. But if you're drawing breath, you are a sinner. You are just like me. You deserve death for sin. And as I had said earlier, it's a harsh reality. 10 out of 10 people die. None of us have control over when we die. except for those of us who choose a moment for whatever reason. But 10 out of 10 of us will die. It's unavoidable. You can avoid taxes and you can outrun law enforcement, but you cannot outrun the specter of death. It doesn't matter if you're 5, 25, 45, 65, 105. You cannot avoid death. You can put it off. You can fight cancer. Sooner or later, your heart's going to stop. Your brain activity is going to cease, and you will die. Because death is a penalty, and it's a just penalty for sin. If you think that you aren't deserving of that penalty, if you don't consider yourself a sinner, I just want you to think about your life. I've seen a lot of kids here today. Most of them have been incredibly obedient. It's amazing. But at the same time, not one of us is a perfectly obedient child, and we weren't when we were children. And if you think you were a perfectly obedient child, I'd ask you to interview your parents for longer than 15 minutes and ask them how perfectly obedient you were. Hello there, young man. You better catch up. You don't want to get run over by a bike. But interview your parents. Just sit down with your parents, if you still can, for 10, 15 minutes and ask them about your perfect obedience. I guarantee you they'll set you straight in a very small amount of time. It will not take them 10 minutes to tell you that you were sinful as a child. One of the things that used to happen to me is my parents would go to my school conferences, and my dad would come home and he would sit me down, and I knew I was in trouble when that happened, when my dad came home from school conferences, and he would say, "Who are you?" And I'd say, "Why? What do you mean?" And he'd say, "Well, your teachers told us that you're the most polite and respectful young man in class." And then he would laugh. And I would ask him, "Why are you laughing?" And he says, "Because you put on two faces. You have one you wear at school, and then there's this one you have on at home. Why are you so good at school, and why are you so disobedient at home?" And I was fortunate to be raised by ostensibly Christian parents. They were believers. They took me to church. But I had, even at a young age, understood that I could fake righteousness. I could fake being a good person by behaving in public. But that didn't mask who I was at home. Didn't mask who I was in private. And I think that's a reality for most of us today, even as adults. We're very often two different types of people in public and in private. When we're at work, we very often will be very respectful. We will be very soft-spoken. We'll be very pleasant to deal with customers and co-workers, and people will not recognize us for anything other than decent, upright human beings. But oftentimes our spouses and our children and our neighbors can give a better account of who we are in our weaknesses and in our downtime and in private than what anybody in public would ever know. And so the harsh reality for us today as human beings, not just in the United States but in general, but let's just say here in the United States, where we're plagued with first world problems, we're plagued with the first world problem of social media, where everybody, even there, will put on this perfect face and will pretend that nothing's wrong and that we don't have any problems. We're plagued with this issue that no matter how hard we try, no matter how much we want to show otherwise, God sees the deep, dark recesses of our hearts, and He knows who we are, not just in public, but in the private moments of our lives, in our hearts. And that One of the things that I run into the most when I do things like this, whether it be on a college campus or in a downtown bar district or here in Lanesboro or other places at different times of day, one of the things I hear the most is, you can't judge me, only God can judge me. People, that should terrify you. You're right, I can't judge. I'm not here judging anyone. I'm not here to judge a single soul. I'm here to tell you that if you think that only God could judge you, you're right. God is the sole judge of all people. He is the only one who can judge you. And the problem for every one of us, especially those of us who cry out, only God can judge me, is that God will judge you when you die. And His judgment of you will be just, and it will be perfect, and it will be righteous, and it will be built on His holiness. So if you are hearing this and you're saying, oh, only God can judge me, you're right. No arguments. Only God can judge you. And I'm pleading with you today, think about what that means. God is not an earthly judge. I happen to be familiar with people who work in that system, in the legal system, and they'll tell you about the fickleness of judges. One judge on one day will let one person go with no bail, no bond, release them on their own recognizance. And the very next day, another person charged with exactly the same crime, the judge will throw a $500,000 bond on them. God's not that kind of judge. God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. He is utterly and totally consistent, never changing, never vacillating, never ending. The same judge of all creation all the time. So yes, that is the God who is the only one that can judge you. And so hear this. This isn't about hell. Hell is a reality. Hell is reserved for all people who fail to repent and believe the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. No arguments. You can deny it. You can say it's not true. You can say it doesn't apply to you. You can say, I don't believe in hell. It doesn't matter. If you say you don't believe in gravity and you go over and you jump off of one of these fine limestone cliffs that we have in this area, all your disbelief in gravity isn't going to mean a thing when you fall from that cliff and you hit the ground. And the same can be said for hell and the judgment of God. You can deny it. You can say you don't believe in it. But it is real, and it is awaiting you if you don't know Christ. Did you get one of these? Check it out. It's $1 million bill, but try not to spend it. So the issue isn't whether or not God is the only one that can judge you. The issue is what does He judge you on? Why does He judge you? And how are you going to be made right with Him? And here's how. You can't earn it. That's the good news. You can't earn it. You cannot earn the justice of God being taken away from you. Nothing you can do. I don't care how many homeless people you help. I don't care how many hungry people you feed. I don't care how many books you read to the illiterate child. I don't care. And I take that back. I care about those things. But what I don't care about in relation to those things is whether or not those things make you feel good about yourself. Because that's all they do. They provide material, earthly comfort for people, and they make you feel good about yourself. But the problem is that's a temporary assuaging of guilt. It's a temporary feeling of comfort. And God is going to look at that ostensibly good work that you have done, and He is going to say, not good enough. And here's why. One sin is infinitely wrong. One sin, when committed against God, is infinitely unholy. Because God, in His person, is infinite and eternal and cannot sin. It's impossible. So when you sin against that type of being, the God of the universe, you are sinning infinitely the first time you sin. So how many good works do you have to do to be made right for one infinite sin? You can't do them. You can't do enough good works. And the problem is you can't stop sinning. Every single one of us, myself included, we sin every day. If you wake up in the morning and you don't thank God for the breath that you draw throughout the night, you are sinning. If you don't thank God for the heartbeat beating in your chest while you sleep, you are sinning. You steal His air when you don't thank Him for giving it to you. You steal His providence when you don't thank Him for watching out for you as you sleep and you are at your most vulnerable moment. So all I'm asking you to think about is where you are compared to God's standards. How do you measure up against God? Because that's the standard. God. Not other people. Not me. Not anybody else that you're going to meet today. Nobody else that you're going to meet tomorrow or in days to come. The standard is God. His justice, His holiness, His eternal moral law. Those are the standards. How do you meet up with that? If you're like me, not very well. And that's why you need Christ. He came, lived a perfect life, perfect obedience as a child to His earthly parents, perfectly obedient to governing authorities in all areas except for those areas where to obey them would have been sin against God. Perfectly loving, perfectly holy, perfectly righteous, tempted in every way. Tempted in all ways. Think about that. Scriptures say that Christ was like us in all ways, tempted to the point of the shedding of His own blood, yet remained without sin. None of us can resist sin so much that it will cause us to shed our own blood the way Christ did. You tempt me enough, I'm going to snap. I'm going to do something I shouldn't do. I'm going to sin. Christ didn't. Didn't matter how He was tempted. It didn't matter how much they came against Him. He loved perfectly. And see, that wasn't just something He did to be an example. That was something that had to be done because He had to keep the law perfectly. If all Jesus had to do was come and die, then God would have sent Jesus to come in the flesh as an adult, put Him on a cross the very next day. But He didn't. He lived the life that we needed to live. He lived the life that we can't live. And then at the end of that life, at the end of 33 years, He was unjustly prosecuted. He was subjected to numerous illegal trials that met no strictures of the law at the time. They didn't meet Jewish law. They didn't meet Roman law. They were done in secret. They were done unjustly. The witnesses lied about Christ. And then, at the end of that, they hung Him on a cross. And the cross wasn't just being victimized by Romans. The cross wasn't just about being physically beat up. Scriptures say He was marred beyond recognition. Like no one could recognize Him. He was so beat up. Imagine the worst accident victim you've ever seen. Jesus was worse than that. That's how bad they beat Him. And then they hung Him on a cross. And then more than that, when He was on the cross, He wasn't just suffering physical pain. Jesus Christ suffered under the wrath of the Father. There was time on the cross where Jesus cried out and He quoted David from Psalm 22 and He said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And many well-meaning people have interpreted that to mean that God could not bear to watch Jesus suffer on the cross. So in his sorrow and in his emotional pain,